Chapter 15 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Langston, cjlangston.com. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 15. The Fete of the Casting. During the 8 months which were employed in the work of excavation, the preparatory works of the casting had been carried on simultaneously with extreme rapidity. A stranger arriving at Stones Hill would have been surprised at the spectacle offered to his view. At 600 yards from the well, and circularly arranged around it as the central point, rose 1,200 reverberating ovens, each 6 feet in diameter, and separated from each other by an interval of 3 feet. The circumference occupied by these 1,200 ovens presented a length of 2 miles. Being all constructed on the same plan, each with its high quadrangular chimney, they produced a most singular effect. It will be remembered that on their third meeting the committee had decided to use cast iron for the Columbiad, and in particular the white description. This metal, in fact, is the most tenacious, the most ductile, the most malleable, and consequently suitable for all molding operations, and when smelted with pit coal is of superior quality for all engineering works requiring great resisting power, such as cannon, steam boilers, hydraulic presses, and the like. Cast iron, however, if subjected to only one single fusion, is rarely sufficiently homogeneous, and it requires a second fusion completely to refine it by dispossessing it of its last earthly deposits. So long before being forwarded to Tampa Town, the iron ore, molten in the great furnaces of Cold Spring, and brought into contact with coal and silicum, heated to a high temperature, was carburized and transformed into cast iron. After this first operation, the metal was sent on to Stones Hill. They had, however, to deal with 136 million pounds of iron, a quantity far too costly to send by railway. The cost of transport would have been double that of material. It appeared preferable to freight vessels at New York, and to load them with the iron in bars. This, however, required not less than 68 vessels of 1,000 tons, a veritable fleet, which, quitting New York on the 3rd of May, on the 10th of the same month ascended the Bay of Espiritu Santo and discharged their cargoes, without dues, in the port at Tampa Town. Thence the iron was transported by rail to Stones Hill, and about the middle of January this enormous mass of metal was delivered at its destination. It will easily be understood that 1,200 furnaces were not too many to melt simultaneously these 60,000 tons of iron. Each of these furnaces contained nearly 140,000 pounds weight of metal. They were all built after the model of those which served for the casting of the Rodman gun. They were trapezoidal in shape, with a high elliptical arch. These furnaces, constructed of fireproof brick, were especially adapted for burning pit coal, with a flat bottom upon which the iron bars were laid. This bottom, inclined at an angle of 25 degrees, allowed the metal to flow into the receiving troughs, and the 1,200 converging trenches carried the molten metal down to the central well. The day following that on which the works of the masonry and boring had been completed, Barbicane set to work upon the central mold. His object now was to raise within the center of the well, and with a coincident axis, a cylinder 900 feet high and 9 feet in diameter, which should exactly fill up the space reserved for the bore of the Columbiad. This cylinder was composed of a mixture of clay and sand, with the addition of a little hay and straw. The space left between the mold and the masonry was intended to be filled up by the molten metal, which would thus form the walls 6 feet in thickness. This cylinder, in order to maintain its equilibrium, had to be bound by iron bands, and firmly fixed at certain intervals by cross clamps fastened into the stone lining. After the castings, these would be buried in the block of metal, leaving no external projection. This operation was completed on the 8th of July, and the run of the metal was fixed for the following day. "This fete of the casting will be a grand ceremony," said J.T. Maston to his friend Barbicane. "Undoubtedly," said Barbicane, "but it will not be a public fete." "What? Will you not open the gates of the enclosure to all comers?" "I must be very careful, Maston. The casting of the Columbiad is an extremely delicate, not to say a dangerous operation, and I should prefer its being done privately. At the discharge of the projectile, a fete if you like. Till then, no." The President was right. The operation involved unforeseen dangers, which a great influx of spectators would have hindered him from averting. It was necessary to preserve complete freedom of movement. No one was admitted within the enclosure except a delegation of members of the Gun Club, who had made the voyage to Tampa Town. Among these was the brisk Bilsby, Tom Hunter, Colonel Blomsberry, Major Elphinstone, General Morgan, and the rest of the lot to whom the casting of the Columbiad was a matter of personal interest. J.T. Maston became their cicerone. He omitted no point of detail. He conducted them throughout the magazines, workshops, through the midst of the engines, and compelled them to visit the whole 1,200 furnaces one after the other. At the end of the 1,200th visit, they were pretty well knocked up. The casting was to take place at 12 o'clock precisely. The previous evening each furnace had been charged with 114,000 pounds weight of metal in bars disposed crossways to each other, so as to allow the hot air to circulate freely between them. At daybreak, the 1,200 chimneys vomited their torrents of flame into the air, and the ground was agitated with dull tremblings. As many pounds of metal as there were to cast, so many pounds of coal were there to burn. Thus, there were 68,000 tons of coal, which projected in the face of the sun a thick curtain of smoke. The heat soon became insupportable within the circle of the furnaces, the rumbling of which resembled the rolling of thunder. The powerful ventilators added their continuous blasts and saturated with oxygen the glowing plates. The operation, to be successful, required to be conducted with great rapidity. On a signal given by a cannon shot, each furnace was to give vent to the molten iron and completely to empty itself. These arrangements made, 4 men and workmen waited the preconcerted moment with an impatience mingled with a certain amount of emotion. Not a soul remained within the enclosure. Each superintendent took his post by the aperture of the run. Barbicane and his colleagues, perched on a neighboring eminence, assisted at the operation. In front of them was a piece of artillery, ready to give fire on the signal from the engineer. Some minutes before midday, the first driblets of metal began to flow. The reservoirs filled little by little, and, by the time that the whole melting was completely accomplished, it was kept in abeyance for a few minutes in order to facilitate the separation of foreign substances. 12 o'clock struck. A gunshot suddenly pealed forth and shot its flame into the air. 1,200 melting troughs were simultaneously opened, and 1,200 fiery serpents crept toward the central well, unrolling their incandescent curves. There, down they plunged with a terrific noise into a depth of 900 feet. It was an exciting and a magnificent spectacle. The ground trembled, while these molten waves, launching into the sky their wreaths of smoke, evaporated the moisture of the mold and hurled it upward through the vent holes of the stone lining in the form of dense vapor clouds. These artificial clouds unrolled their thick spirals to a height of 1,000 yards into the air. A savage, wandering somewhere beyond the limits of the horizon, might have believed that some new crater was forming in the bosom of Florida, although there was neither any eruption, nor typhoon, nor storm, nor struggle of the elements, nor any of those terrible phenomena which nature is capable of producing. No, it was man alone who had produced these reddish vapors, these gigantic flames worthy of a volcano itself, these tremendous vibrations resembling the shock of an earthquake, these reverberations rivaling those of hurricanes and storms, and it was his hand which precipitated into an abyss, dug by himself, a whole Niagara of molten metal. End of chapter 15.
Chapters 16 and 17 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Ann Walden. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 16. The Columbiad. Had the casting succeeded? They were reduced to mere conjecture. There was indeed every reason to expect success, since the mold had absorbed the entire mass of the molten metal. Still, some considerable time must elapse before they could arrive at any certainty upon the matter. The patience of the members of the Gun Club was sorely tried during this period of time, but they could do nothing. J.T. Maston escaped roasting by a miracle. 15 days after the casting an immense column of smoke was still rising in the open sky, and the ground burned the soles of the feet within a radius of 200 feet round the summit of Stone's Hill. It was impossible to approach nearer. All they could do was to wait with what patience they might. "Here we are at the 10th of August," exclaimed J.T. Maston one morning. "Only 4 months to the 1st of December. We shall never be ready in time." Barbicane said nothing, but his silence covered serious irritation. However, daily observations revealed a certain change going on in the state of the ground. About the 15th of August, the vapors ejected had sensibly diminished in intensity and thickness. Some days afterward the earth exhaled only a slight puff of smoke, the last breath of the monster enclosed within its circle of stone. Little by little the belt of heat contracted, until on the 22nd of August, Barbicane, his colleagues, and the engineer were enabled to set foot on the iron sheet which lay level upon the summit of Stone's Hill. "At last!" exclaimed the president of the Gun Club, with an immense sigh of relief. The work was resumed the same day. They proceeded at once to extract the interior mold for the purpose of clearing out the boring of the piece. Pickaxes and boring irons were set to work without intermission. The clayey and sandy soils had acquired extreme hardness under the action of the heat, but by the aid of the machines, the rubbish on being dug out was rapidly carted away on railway wagons, and such was the ardor of the work, so persuasive the arguments of Barbicane's dollars, that by the 3rd of September all traces of the mold had entirely disappeared. Immediately the operation of boring was commenced, and by the aid of powerful machines, a few weeks later, the inner surface of the immense tube had been rendered perfectly cylindrical, and the bore of the piece had acquired a thorough polish. At length, on the 22nd of September, less than a 12-month after Barbicane's original proposition, the enormous weapon, accurately bored, and exactly vertically pointed, was ready for work. There was only the moon now to wait for, and they were pretty sure that she would not fail in the rendezvous. The ecstasy of J.T. Maston knew no bounds, and he narrowly escaped a frightful fall while staring down the tube. But for the strong hand of Colonel Bloomsbury, the worthy secretary, like a modern Erostratus, would have found his death in the depths of the Columbiad. The cannon was then finished. There was no possible doubt as to its perfect completion. So, on the 6th of October, Captain Nicholl opened an account between himself and President Barbicane, in which he debited himself to the latter in the sum of $2,000. One may believe that the captain's wrath was increased to its highest point, and must have made him seriously ill. However, he had still 3 bets of $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000 respectively, and if he gained 2 out of these his position would not be very bad. But the money question did not enter into his calculations. It was the success of his rival in casting a cannon against which iron plates 60 feet thick would have been ineffectual, that dealt him a terrible blow. After the 23rd of September, the enclosure of Stones Hill was thrown open to the public, and it will be easily imagined what was the concourse of visitors to this spot. There was an incessant flow of people to and from Tampa Town and the place, which resembled a procession, or rather, in fact, a pilgrimage. It was already clear to be seen that, on the day of the experiment itself, the aggregate of spectators would be counted by millions, for they were already arriving from all parts of the earth upon this narrow strip of promontory. Europe was immigrating to America. Up to that time, however, it must be confessed, the curiosity of the numerous comers was but scantily gratified. Most had counted upon witnessing the spectacle of the casting, and they were treated to nothing but smoke. This was sorry food for hungry eyes, but Barbicane would admit no one to that operation. Then ensued grumbling, discontent, murmurs. They blamed the president, taxed him with dictatorial conduct. His proceedings were declared un-American. There was very nearly a riot round Stones Hill, but Barbicane remained inflexible. When, however, the Columbiad was entirely finished, this state of closed doors could no longer be maintained. Besides, it would have been bad taste, and even imprudence, to affront the public feeling. Barbicane, therefore, opened the enclosure to all comers, but, true to his practical disposition, he determined to coin money out of the public curiosity. It was something, indeed, to be enabled to contemplate this immense Columbiad, but to descend into its depths, this seemed to the Americans the ne plus ultra of earthly felicity. Consequently, there was not one curious spectator who was not willing to give himself the treat of visiting the interior of this great metallic abyss. Baskets suspended from steam cranes permitted them to satisfy their curiosity. There was a perfect mania. Women, children, old men, all made it a point of duty to penetrate the mysteries of the colossal gun. The fare for the descent was fixed at $5 per head, and despite this high charge, during the 2 months which preceded the experiment, the influx of visitors enabled the Gun Club to pocket nearly $500,000. It is needless to say that the first visitors of the Columbiad were the members of the Gun Club. This privilege was justly reserved for that illustrious body. The ceremony took place on the 25th of September. A basket of honor took down the President, J.T. Maston, Major Elphinstone, General Morgan, Colonel Bloomsbury, and other members of the club, to the number of 10 in all. How hot it was at the bottom of that long tube of metal! They were half suffocated. But what delight! What ecstasy! A table had been laid with 6 covers on the massive stone which formed the bottom of the Columbiad, and lighted by a jet of electric light, resembling that of day itself. Numerous exquisite dishes, which seemed to descend from heaven, were placed successively before the guests, and the richest wines of France flowed in profusion during this splendid repast, served 900 feet beneath the surface of the earth. The festival was animated, not to say somewhat noisy. Toasts flew backward and forward. They drank to the earth and to her satellite, to the Gun Club, the Union, the Moon, Diana, Phoebe, Selene, the peaceful courier of the night. All the hurrahs, carried upward upon the sonorous waves of the immense acoustic tube, arrived with the sound of thunder at its mouth, and the multitude ranged round Stones Hill heartily united their shouts with those of the 10 revelers hidden from view at the bottom of the gigantic Columbiad. J.T. Maston was no longer master of himself. Whether he shouted or gesticulated, ate or drank most, would be a difficult matter to determine. At all events, he would not have given his place up for an empire, not even if the cannon, loaded, primed, and fired at that very moment, were to blow him in pieces into the planetary world. Chapter 17. A Telegraphic Dispatch. The great works undertaken by the Gun Club had now virtually come to an end, and 2 months still remained before the day for the discharge of the shot to the moon. To the general impatience these 2 months appeared as long as years. Hitherto the smallest details of the operation had been daily chronicled by the journals, which the public devoured with eager eyes. Just at this moment a circumstance, the most unexpected, the most extraordinary and incredible, occurred to rouse afresh their panting spirits, and to throw every mind into a state of the most violent excitement. One day, the 30th of September, at 3:47 p.m., a telegram, transmitted by cable from Valentia, Ireland, to Newfoundland and the American mainland, arrived at the address of President Barbicane. The President tore open the envelope, read the dispatch, and, despite his remarkable powers of self-control, his lips turned pale and his eyes grew dim on reading the 20 words of this telegram. Here is the text of the dispatch, which figures now in the archives of the Gun Club. France, Paris, 30 September, 4 a.m. Barbicane, Tampa Town, Florida, United States. Substitute for your spherical shell a cylindro-conical projectile. I shall go inside. Shall arrive by steamer Atlanta. Michel Ardan. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 18. The Passenger of the Atlanta. If this astounding news, instead of flying through the electric wires, had simply arrived by post in the ordinary sealed envelope, Barbicane would not have hesitated a moment. He would have held his tongue about it, both as a measure of prudence, and in order not to have to reconsider his plans. This telegram might be a cover for some jest, especially as it came from a Frenchman. What human being would ever have conceived the idea of such a journey? And, if such a person really existed, he must be an idiot, whom one would shut up in a lunatic ward, rather than within the walls of the projectile. The contents of the dispatch, however, speedily became known, for the telegraphic officials possessed but little discretion, and Michel Ardan's proposition ran at once throughout the several states of the Union. Barbicane had, therefore, no further motives for keeping silence. Consequently, he called together such of his colleagues as were at the moment in Tampa Town, and without any expression of his own opinions, simply read to them the laconic text itself. It was received with every possible variety of expressions of doubt, incredulity, and derision from everyone, without the exception of J.T. Maston, who exclaimed, "It is a grand idea, however." When Barbicane originally proposed to send a shot to the moon, everyone looked upon the enterprise as simple and practicable enough, a mere question of gunnery. But when a person, professing to be a reasonable being, offered to take passage within the projectile, the whole thing became a farce, or, in plainer language, a humbug. One question, however, remained. Did such a being exist? This telegram, flashed across the depths of the Atlantic, the designation of the vessel on board which he was to take his passage, the date assigned for his speedy arrival, all combined to impart a certain character of reality to the proposal. They must get some clearer notion of the matter. Scattered groups of inquirers at length condensed themselves into a compact crowd, which made straight for the residence of President Barbicane. That worthy individual was keeping quiet with the intention of watching events as they arose, but he had forgotten to take into account the public impatience, and it was with no pleasant countenance that he watched the population of Tampa Town gathering under his windows. The murmurs and vociferations below presently obliged him to appear. He came forward, therefore, and, on silence being procured, a citizen put point blank to him the following question: "Is the person mentioned in the telegram under the name of Michel Ardan on his way here? Yes or no?" "Gentlemen," replied Barbicane, "I know no more than you do." "We must know," roared the impatient voices. "Time will show," calmly replied the president. "Time has no business to keep the whole country in suspense," replied the orator. "Have you altered the plans of the projectile according to the request of the telegram?" "Not yet, gentlemen, but you are right. We must have better information to go by. The telegraph must complete its information." "To the telegraph!" roared the crowd. Barbicane descended, and heading the immense assemblage, led the way to the telegraph office. A few minutes later a telegram was dispatched to the Secretary of the Underwaters at Liverpool, requesting answers to the following queries: "About the ship Atlanta. When did she leave Europe? Had she on board a Frenchman named Michel Ardan?" 2 hours afterwards Barbicane received information too exact to leave room for the smallest remaining doubt. The steamer Atlanta from Liverpool put to sea on the 2nd of October, bound for Tampa Town, having on board a Frenchman born on the list of passengers by the name of Michel Ardan. That very evening he wrote to the house of Breadwill & Co., requesting them to suspend the casting of the projectile until the receipt of further orders. On the 10th of October, at 9 a.m., the semaphores of the Bahama Canal signalled a thick smoke on the horizon. 2 hours later, a large steamer exchanged signals with them. The name of the Atlanta flew at once over Tampa Town. At 4 o'clock, the English vessel entered the Bay of Espiritu Santo. At 5 it crossed the passage of Hillsborough Bay at full steam. At 6 she cast anchor at Port Tampa. The anchor had scarcely caught the sandy bottom, when 500 boats surrounded the Atlanta, and the steamer was taken by assault. Barbicane was the first to set foot on deck, and in a voice of which he vainly tried to conceal the emotion, called "Michel Ardan." "Here," replied an individual perched on the poop. Barbicane, with arms crossed, looked fixedly at the passenger of the Atlanta. He was a man of about 42 years of age, of large build, but slightly round-shouldered. His massive head momentarily shook a shock of reddish hair, which resembled a lion's mane. His face was short with a broad forehead, and furnished with a moustache as bristly as a cat's, and little patches of yellowish whiskers upon his full cheeks. Round, wildish eyes, slightly near-sighted, completed a physiognomy essentially feline. His nose was firmly shaped, his mouth particularly sweet in expression, high forehead, intelligent and furrowed with wrinkles like a newly ploughed field. The body was powerfully developed and firmly fixed upon long legs. Muscular arms and a general air of decision gave him the appearance of a hardy, jolly companion. He was dressed in a suit of ample dimensions, loose neckerchief, open shirt-collar, disclosing a robust neck. His cuffs were invariably unbuttoned, through which appeared a pair of red hands. On the bridge of the steamer, in the midst of the crowd, he bustled to and fro, never still for a moment, dragging his anchors, as the sailors say, gesticulating, making free with everybody, biting his nails with nervous avidity. He was one of those originals which nature sometimes invents in the freak of a moment, and of which she then breaks the mould. Among other peculiarities, this curiosity gave himself out for a sublime ignoramus, like Shakespeare, and professed supreme contempt for all scientific men. Those fellows, as he called them, are only fit to mark the points while we play the game. He was, in fact, a thorough bohemian, adventurous but not an adventurer, a hare-brained fellow, a kind of Icarus, only possessing relays of wings. For the rest, he was ever in scrapes, ending invariably by falling on his feet, like those little figures which they sell for children's toys. In a few words, his motto was, "I have my opinions," and the love of the impossible constituted his ruling passion. Such was the passenger of the Atlanta, always excitable, as if boiling under the action of some internal fire by the character of his physical organisation. If ever two individuals offered a striking contrast to each other, these were certainly Michel Ardan and the Yankee Barbicane, both, moreover, being equally enterprising and daring, each in his own way. The scrutiny which the president of the Gun Club had instituted regarding this new rival was quickly interrupted by the shouts and hurrahs of the crowd. The cries became at last so uproarious, and the popular enthusiasm assumed so personal a form, that Michel Ardan, after having shaken hands some thousands of times, at the imminent risk of leaving his fingers behind him, was fain at last to make a bolt for his cabin. Barbicane followed him without uttering a word. "You are Barbicane, I suppose?" said Michel Ardan, in a tone of voice in which he would have addressed a friend of 20 years' standing. "Yes," replied the president of the Gun Club. "All right. How do you do, Barbicane? How are you getting on? Pretty well, that's right." "So," said Barbicane, without further preliminary, "you are quite determined to go?" "Quite decided. Nothing will stop you?" "Nothing. Have you modified your projectile according to my telegram?" "I have waited for your arrival, but," asked Barbicane again, "have you carefully reflected?" "Reflected? Have I any time to spare? I find an opportunity of making a tour in the moon, and I mean to profit by it. There is the whole gist of the matter." Barbicane looked hard at this man who spoke so lightly of his project, with such complete absence of anxiety. "But at least," said he, "you have some plans, some means of carrying your project into execution?" "Excellent, my dear Barbicane. Only permit me to offer one remark. My wish is to tell my story once and for all to everybody, and then have done with it. Then there will be no need for recapitulation. So, if you have no objection, assemble your friends, colleagues, the whole town, all of Florida, all America if you like, and tomorrow I shall be ready to explain my plans and answer any objections whatever that may be advanced. You may rest assured I shall wait without stirring. Will that suit you?" "All right," replied Barbicane. So saying, the president left the cabin, and informed the crowd of the proposal of Michel Ardan. His words were received with clappings of hands and shouts of joy. They had removed all difficulties. Tomorrow everyone would contemplate at his ease this European hero. However, some of the spectators, more infatuated than the rest, would not leave the deck of the Atlanta. They passed the night on board. Among others, J.T. Maston got his hook fixed in the coaming of the poop, and it pretty nearly required the capstan to get it out again. "He is a hero, he cried, a theme of which he was never tired of ringing the changes, and we are only like weak, silly women compared with this European." As to the president, after having suggested to the visitors it was time to retire, he re-entered the passengers' cabin and remained there till the bell of the steamer made its midnight. But then the two rivals in popularity shook hands heartily, and parted on terms of intimate friendship. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 19. A Monster Meeting. On the following day, Barbicane, fearing that indiscreet questions might be put to Michel Ardan, was desirous of reducing the number of the audience to a few of the initiated, his own colleagues, for instance. He might as well have tried to check the Falls of Niagara. He was compelled, therefore, to give up the idea, and let his new friend run the chances of a public conference. The place chosen for this monster meeting was a vast plain situated in the rear of the town. In a few hours, thanks to the help of the shipping in port, an immense roofing of canvas was stretched over the parched prairie, and protected it from the burning rays of the sun. There 300,000 people braved for many hours the stifling heat while awaiting the arrival of the Frenchmen. Of this crowd of spectators, a first set could both see and hear, a second set saw badly and heard nothing at all, and as for the third, it could neither see nor hear anything at all. At 3 o'clock Michel Ardan made his appearance, accompanied by the principal members of the Gun Club. He was supported on his right by President Barbicane, and on his left by J.T. Maston, more radiant than the midday sun, and nearly as ruddy. Ardan mounted a platform, from the top of which his view extended over a sea of black hats. He exhibited not the slightest embarrassment. He was just as gay, familiar, and pleasant as if he were at home. To the hurrahs which greeted him he replied by a graceful bow. Then, waving his hands to request silence, he spoke in perfectly correct English as follows: "Gentlemen, despite the very hot weather, I request your patience for a short time, while I offer some explanations regarding the projects which seem to have so interested you. I am neither an orator nor a man of science, and I had no idea of addressing you in public. But my friend Barbicane has told me that you would like to hear me, and I am quite at your service. Listen to me, therefore, with your 600,000 ears, and please excuse the faults of the speaker. Now pray do not forget that you see before you a perfect ignoramus whose ignorance goes so far that he cannot even understand the difficulties. It seemed to him that it was a matter quite simple, natural, and easy to take one's place in a projectile and start for the moon. That journey must be undertaken sooner or later, and as for the mode of locomotion adopted, it follows simply the law of progress. Man began walking on all fours, then, one fine day, on 2 feet, then in a carriage, then in a stage-coach, and lastly by railway. Well, the projectile is the vehicle of the future, and the planets themselves are nothing else. Now, some of you, gentlemen, may imagine that the velocity we propose to impart to it is extravagant. It is nothing of the kind. All the stars exceed it in rapidity, and the earth herself is at this moment carrying us around the sun at 3 times as rapid a rate, and yet she is a mere lounger on the way compared with many other of the planets, and her velocity is constantly decreasing. Is it not evident, then, I ask you, that there will some day appear velocities far greater than these, of which light or electricity will probably be the mechanical agent? Yes, gentlemen," continued the orator, "in spite of the opinions of certain narrow-minded people who would shut up the human race upon this globe, as within some magical circle which it must never outstep, we shall one day travel to the moon, the planets, and the stars with the same facility, rapidity, and certainty as we now make the voyage from Liverpool to New York. Distance is but a relative expression, and must end by being reduced to 0. The assembly, strongly predisposed as they were in favor of the French hero, were slightly staggered at this bold theory. Michel Ardan perceived the fact. "Gentlemen," he continued with a pleasant smile, "you do not seem quite convinced. Very good, let us reason the matter out. Do you know how long it would take for an express train to reach the moon? 300 days, no more. And what is that? The distance is no more than 9 times the circumference of the earth, and there are no sailors or travelers of even moderate activity who have not made longer journeys than that in their lifetime. And now consider that I shall be only 97 hours on my journey. Ah, I see you are reckoning that the moon is a long way off from the earth, and that one must think twice before making the experiment. What would you say, then, if we were talking of going to Neptune, which revolves at a distance of more than 2,720 million miles from the sun? And yet what is that compared with the distance of the fixed stars, some of which, such as Arcturus, are billions of miles distant from us? And then you talk of the distance which separates the planets from the sun, and there are people who affirm that such a thing as distance exists. Absurdity, folly, idiotic nonsense! Would you know what I think of our own solar universe? Shall I tell you my theory? It is very simple. In my opinion, the solar system is a solid, homogeneous body. The planets which compose it are in actual contact with each other, and whatever space exists between them is nothing more than the space which separates the molecules of the densest metal, such as silver, iron, or platinum. I have the right, therefore, to affirm, and I repeat, with the conviction which must penetrate all your minds, distance is but an empty name. Distance does not really exist. "Hurrah!" cried one voice. Need it be said that it was that of J.T. Maston? "Distance does not exist!" And overcome by the energy of his movements, he nearly fell from the platform to the ground. He just escaped a severe fall, which would have proved to him that distance was by no means an empty name. "Gentlemen," resumed the orator, "I repeat that the distance between the earth and her satellite is a mere trifle, and undeserving of serious consideration. I am convinced that before 20 years are over, one half of our earth will have paid a visit to the moon. Now, my worthy friends, if you have any question to put to me, you will, I fear, sadly embarrass a poor man like myself. Still, I will do my best to answer you." Up to this point the president of the Gun Club had been satisfied with the turn which the discussion had assumed. It became now, however, desirable to divert Arden from questions of a practical nature with which he was doubtless far less conversant. Barbicane, therefore, hastened to get in a word, and began by asking his new friend whether he thought that the moon and planets were inhabited. "You put before me a great problem, my worthy president," replied the orator, smiling. "Still, men of great intelligence, such as Plutarch, Swedenborg, Bernardin de Saint Pierre, and others have, if I mistake not, pronounced in the affirmative, looking at the question from the natural philosopher's point of view. I should say that nothing useless existed in the world, and, replying to your question by another, I should venture to assert that if these worlds are habitable, they either are, have been, or will be inhabited." "No one could answer more logically or fairly," replied the president. "The question then reverts to this: are these worlds habitable? For my own part, I believe they are." "For myself, I feel certain of it," said Michel Ardan. "Nevertheless," retorted one of the audience, "there are many arguments against the habitability of the worlds. The conditions of life must evidently be greatly modified upon the majority of them. To mention only the planets, we should be either broiled alive in some, or frozen to death in others, according as they are more or less removed from the sun." "I regret," replied Michel Ardan, "that I have not the honor of personally knowing my contradictor, for I would have attempted to answer him. His objection has its merits, I admit, but I think we may successfully combat it, as well as all others which affect the habitability of other worlds. If I were a natural philosopher, I would tell him that if less of caloric were set in motion upon the planets which are nearest to the sun, and more, on the contrary, upon those which are the furthest removed from it, this simple fact would alone suffice to equalize the heat, and to render the temperature of those worlds supportable by beings organized like ourselves. If I were a naturalist, I would tell him that, according to some illustrious men of science, nature has furnished us with instances upon the earth of animals existing under very varying conditions of life; that fish respire in a medium fatal to other animals; that amphibious creatures possess a double existence very difficult of explanation; that certain denizens of the seas maintain life at enormous depths, and there support a pressure equal to that of 50 or 60 atmospheres without being crushed; that several aquatic insects, insensible to temperature, are met with equally among boiling springs and in the frozen plains of the Polar Sea. In fine, we cannot help recognizing in nature a diversity of means of operation oftentimes incomprehensible, but not the less real. If I were a chemist, I would tell him that the aerolites, bodies evidently formed exteriorly of our terrestrial globe, have, upon analysis, revealed indisputable traces of carbon, a substance which owes its origin solely to organized beings, and which, according to the experiments of Reichenbach, must necessarily itself have been endued with animation. And lastly, were I a theologian, I would tell him that the scheme of the divine redemption, according to St. Paul, seems to be applicable, not merely to the earth, but to all the celestial worlds. But unfortunately, I am neither theologian, nor chemist, nor naturalist, nor philosopher. Therefore, in my absolute ignorance of the great laws which govern the universe, I confine myself to saying in reply, I do not know whether the worlds are inhabited or not, and since I do not know, I am going to see. Whether Michel Ardan's antagonist hazarded any further arguments or not, it is impossible to say, for the uproarious shouts of the crowd would not allow any expression of opinion to gain a hearing. On silence being restored, the triumphant orator contented himself with adding the following remarks. Gentlemen, you will observe that I have but slightly touched upon this great question. There is another altogether different line of argument in favour of the habitability of the stars, which I omit for the present. I only desire to call attention to one point. To those who maintain that the planets are not inhabited, one may reply, you might be perfectly in the right, if you could only show that the earth is the best possible world, in spite of what Voltaire has said. She has but one satellite, while Jupiter, Uranus, Saturn, Neptune have each several, an advantage by no means to be despised. But that which renders our own globe so uncomfortable is the inclination of its axis to the plane of its orbit. Hence the inequality of days and nights, hence the disagreeable diversity of the seasons. On the surface of our unhappy spheroid we are always either too hot or too cold. We are frozen in winter, broiled in summer. It is the planet of rheumatism, coughs, bronchitis, while on the surface of Jupiter, for example, where the axis is but slightly inclined, the inhabitants may enjoy uniform temperatures. It possesses zones of perpetual springs, summers, autumns, and winters. Every Jovian may choose for himself what climate he likes, and there spend the whole of his life in security from all variations of temperature. You will, I am sure, readily admit this superiority of Jupiter over our own planet, to say nothing of his years, which equal 12 of ours. Under such auspices and such marvellous conditions of existence, it appears to me that the inhabitants of so fortunate a world must be in every respect superior to ourselves. All we require, in order to attain such perfection, is the mere trifle of having an axis of rotation less inclined to the plane of its orbit. "Hurrah!" roared an energetic voice. "Let us unite our efforts, invent the necessary machines, and rectify the earth's axis." A thunder of applause followed this proposal, the author of which, of course, was no other than J.T. Maston. And in all probability, if the truth must be told, if the Yankees could have only found a point of application for it, they would have constructed a lever capable of raising the earth and rectifying its axis. It was just this deficiency which baffled these daring mechanicians. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Meredith Hughes, Cambridge, Massachusetts. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 20. Attack and Riposte. As soon as the excitement had subsided, the following words were heard uttered in a strong and determined voice. Now that the speaker has favored us with so much imagination, would he be so good as to return to his subject and give us a little practical view of the question? All eyes were directed towards the person who spoke. He was a little dried-up man, of an active figure, with an American goatee beard. Profiting by the different movements in the crowd, he had managed by degrees to gain the front row of spectators. There, with arms crossed and stern gaze, he watched the hero of the meeting. After having put his question, he remained silent, and appeared to take no notice of the thousands of looks directed toward himself, nor of the murmur of disapprobation excited by his words. Meeting at first with no reply, he repeated his question with marked emphasis, adding, "We are here to talk about the moon, and not about the earth." "You are right, sir," replied Michel Ardan. "The discussion has become irregular. We will return to the moon." "Sir," said the unknown, "you pretend that our satellite is inhabited. Very good, but if Selenites do exist, that race of beings assuredly must live without breathing, for, I warn you for your own sake, there is not the smallest particle of air on the surface of the moon." At this remark, Ardan pushed up his shock of red hair. He saw that he was on the point of being involved in a struggle with this person upon the very gist of the whole question. He looked sternly at him in his turn, and said, "Oh, so there is no air in the moon? And pray, if you are so good, who ventures to affirm that?" "The men of science." "Really?" "Sir," replied Michel, "pleasantry apart, I have a profound respect for men of science who do possess science, but a profound contempt for men of science who do not." "Do you know any who belong to the latter category?" "Decidedly. In France there are some who maintain that, mathematically, a bird cannot possibly fly, and others who demonstrate theoretically that fishes were never made to live in water." "I have nothing to do with persons of that description, and I can quote, in support of my statement, names which you cannot refuse deference to." "Then, sir, you will sadly embarrass a poor ignorant who, besides, asks nothing better than to learn." "Why, then, do you introduce scientific questions if you have never studied them?" asked the unknown, somewhat coarsely. "For the reason that he is always brave who never suspects danger. I know nothing, it is true, but it is precisely my very weakness which constitutes my strength." "Your weakness amounts to folly," retorted the unknown in a passion. "All the better," replied our Frenchman, "if it carries me up to the moon." Barbicane and his colleagues devoured with their eyes the intruder who had so boldly placed himself in antagonism to their enterprise. Nobody knew him, and the president, uneasy as to the result of so free a discussion, watched his new friend with some anxiety. The meeting began to be somewhat fidgety also, for the contest directed their attention to the dangers, if not the actual impossibilities, of the proposed expedition. "Sir," replied Ardan's antagonist, "there are many and incontrovertible reasons which prove the absence of an atmosphere in the moon. I might say that a priori if one ever did exist it must have been absorbed by the earth, but I prefer to bring forward indisputable facts." "Bring them forward, then, sir, as many as you please." "You know," said the stranger, "that when any luminous rays cross a medium such as the air, they are deflected out of the straight line. In other words, they undergo refraction. Well, when stars are occulted by the moon, their rays, on grazing the edge of her disk, exhibit not the least deviation, nor offer the slightest indication of refraction. It follows, therefore, that the moon cannot be surrounded by an atmosphere." "In point of fact," replied Ardan, "this is your chief, if not your only argument, and a really scientific man might be puzzled to answer it. For myself, I will simply say that it is defective, because it assumes that the angular diameter of the moon has been completely determined, which is not the case. But let us proceed. Tell me, my dear sir, do you admit the existence of volcanoes on the moon's surface?" "Extinct, yes. Inactivity, no." "These volcanoes, however, were at one time in a state of activity." "True, but as they furnish themselves the oxygen necessary for combustion, the mere fact of their eruption does not prove the presence of an atmosphere." "Proceed again, then, and let us set aside this class of arguments in order to come to direct observations. In 1715, the astronomers Louville and Halley, watching the eclipse of the 3rd of May, remarked some very extraordinary scintillations. These jets of light, rapid in nature and of frequent recurrence, they attributed to thunderstorms generated in the lunar atmosphere. "In 1715," replied the unknown, "the astronomers Louville and Halley mistook for lunar phenomena some which were purely terrestrial, such as meteoric or other bodies which are generated in our own atmosphere. This was the scientific explanation at the time of the facts, and that is my answer now." "On again, then," replied Arden. "Herschel, in 1718, observed a great number of luminous points on the moon's surface, did he not?" "Yes, but without offering any solution of them. Herschel himself never inferred from them the necessity of a lunar atmosphere. And I may add that Baer and Medler, two great authorities upon the moon, are quite agreed as to the entire absence of air upon its surface." A movement was here manifest among the assemblage, who appeared to be growing excited by the arguments of this singular personage. "Let us proceed," replied Arden with perfect coolness, "and come to one important fact. A skilful French astronomer, M. Laussedat, in watching the eclipse of July 18th, 1860, proved that the horns of the lunar crescent were rounded and truncated. Now, this appearance could only have been produced by a deviation of the solar rays in traversing the atmosphere of the moon. There is no other possible explanation of the facts." "But this is established as a fact?" "Absolutely certain." A counter-movement here took place in favor of the hero of the meeting, whose opponent was now reduced to silence. Arden resumed the conversation, and without exhibiting any exultation at the advantage he had gained, simply said, "You see then, my dear sir, we must not pronounce with absolute positiveness against the existence of an atmosphere in the moon. That atmosphere is, probably, of extreme rarity. Nevertheless, at the present day, science generally admits that it exists." "Not in the mountains, at all event," returned the unknown, unwilling to give in. "No, but at the bottom of valleys, and not exceeding a few 100 feet in height." "In any case, you will do well to take every precaution, for the air will be terribly rarefied." "My good sir, there will always be enough for a solitary individual. Besides, once arrived up there, I shall do my best to economize, and not to breathe except on grand occasions." A tremendous roar of laughter rang in the ears of the mysterious interlocutor, who glared fiercely round upon the assembly. "Then," continued Arden with a careless air, "since we are in accord regarding the presence of a certain atmosphere, we are forced to admit the presence of a certain quantity of water. This is a happy consequence for me. Moreover, my amiable contradictor, permit me to submit to you one further observation. We only know one side of the moon's disk, and if there is but little air on the face presented to us, it is possible that there is plenty on the one turned away from us." "And for what reason?" "Because the moon, under the action of the earth's attraction, has assumed the form of an egg, which we look at from the smaller end. Hence it follows, by Hausen's calculations, that its center of gravity is situated in the other hemisphere. Hence it results that the great mass of air and water must have been drawn away to the other face of our satellite during the first days of its creation." "Pure fancies!" cried the unknown. "No, pure theories, which are based upon the laws of mechanics, and it seems difficult to me to refute them. I appeal then to this meeting, and I put it to them whether life, such as exists upon the earth, is possible upon the surface of the moon." 300,000 auditors at once applauded the proposition. Arden's opponent tried to get in another word, but he could not obtain a hearing. Cries and menaces fell upon him like hail. "Enough! Enough!" cried some. "Drive the intruder off!" shouted others. "Turn him out!" roared the exasperated crowd. But he, holding firmly on to the platform, did not budge an inch, and let the storm pass on, which would soon have assumed formidable proportions if Michel Arden had not quieted it by a gesture. He was too chivalrous to abandon his opponent in an apparent extremity. "You wished to say a few more words?" he asked, in a pleasant voice. "Yes, 1,000, or rather, no, only one. If you persevere in your enterprise, you must be a very rash person, How can you treat me as such? Me, who have demanded a cylindro-conical projectile in order to prevent turning round and round on my way like a squirrel? But, unhappy man, the dreadful recoil will smash you to pieces at your starting. My dear contradictor, you have just put your finger upon the true and only difficulty. Nevertheless, I have too good an opinion of the industrial genius of the Americans not to believe that they will succeed in overcoming it. But the heat developed by the rapidity of the projectile in crossing the strata of air. Oh, the walls are thick, and I shall soon have crossed the atmosphere. But victuals and water! I have calculated for a 12-month supply, and I shall be only 4 days on the journey. But for air to breathe on the road, I shall make it by a chemical process. But your fall on the moon, supposing you ever reach it. It will be 6 times less dangerous than a sudden fall upon the earth, because the weight will be only 1/6 as great on the surface of the moon. Still, it will be enough to smash you like glass. What is to prevent my retarding the shock by means of rockets conveniently placed and lighted at the right moment? But after all, supposing all difficulties surmounted, all obstacles removed, supposing everything combined to favor you, and granting that you may arrive safe and sound in the moon, how will you come back? I am not coming back. At this reply, almost sublime in its very simplicity, the assembly became silent. But its silence was more eloquent than could have been its cries of enthusiasm. The unknown profited by the opportunity, and once more protested. "You will inevitably kill yourself," he cried, "and your death will be that of a madman, useless even to science." "Go on, my dear unknown, for truly your prophecies are most agreeable." "It really is too much," cried Michel Ardan's adversary. "I do not know why I should continue so frivolous a discussion. Please yourself about this insane expedition. We need not trouble ourselves about you." "Pray, don't stand upon ceremony." "No, another person is responsible for your act." "Who, may I ask?" demanded Michel Ardan in an imperious tone. "The ignoramus who organized this equally absurd and impossible experiment." The attack was direct. Barbicane, ever since the interference of the unknown, had been making fearful efforts of self-control. Now, however, seeing himself directly attacked, he could restrain himself no longer. He rose suddenly, and was rushing upon the enemy who thus braved him to the face, when all at once he found himself separated from him. The platform was lifted by 100 strong arms, and the president of the Gun Club shared with Michel Ardan triumphal honors. The shield was heavy, but the bearers came in continuous relays, disputing, struggling, even fighting among themselves in their eagerness to lend their shoulders to this demonstration. But the unknown had not profited by the tumult to quit his post. Besides, he could not have done, in the midst of that compact crowd. There he held on in the front row with crossed arms, glaring at President Barbicane. The shouts of the immense crowd continued at their highest pitch throughout this triumphant march. Michel Ardan took it all with evident pleasure. His face gleamed with delight. Several times the platform seemed seized with pitching and rolling like a weather-beaten ship. But the 2 heroes of the meeting had good sea legs. They never stumbled, and their vessel arrived without dues at the port of Tampa Town. Michel Ardan managed fortunately to escape from the last embraces of his vigorous admirers. He made for the Hotel Franklin, quickly gained his chamber, and slid under the bedclothes, while an army of 100,000 men kept watch under his windows. During this time, a scene, short, grave, and decisive, took place between the mysterious personage and the president of the Gun Club. Barbicane, free at last, had gone straight to his adversary. "Come," he said shortly. The other followed him on the quay, and the 2 presently found themselves alone at the entrance of an open wharf on Jones Fall. The 2 enemies, still mutually unknown, gazed at each other. "Who are you?" asked Barbicane. "Captain Nicholl." "So I suspected. Hitherto chance has never thrown you in my way." "I am come for that purpose." "You have insulted me." "Publicly." "And you will answer to me for this insult?" "At this very moment." No, I desire that all that passes between us shall be secret. There is a wood situated 3 miles from Tampa, the wood of Skersnaw. Do you know it? I know it. Will you be so good as to enter it tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock on one side? Yes, if you will enter at the other side at the same hour. And you will not forget your rifle, said Barbicane. No more than you will forget yours, replied Nicholl. These words having been coldly spoken, the president of the Gun Club and the captain parted. Barbicane returned to his lodging, but instead of snatching a few hours of repose, he passed the night in endeavoring to discover a means of evading the recoil of the projectile, and resolving the difficult problem proposed by Michel Ardan during their discussion at the meeting. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Ann Walden. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. How a Frenchman Manages an Affair. While the contract of this duel was being discussed by the president and the captain, this dreadful savage duel in which each adversary became a man-hunter, Michel Ardan was resting from the fatigues of his triumph. Resting is hardly an appropriate expression, for American beds rival marble or granite tables for hardness. Ardan was sleeping, then, badly enough, tossing about between the cloths which served him for sheets, and he was dreaming of making a more comfortable couch in his projectile when a frightful noise disturbed his dreams. Thundering blows shook his door. They seemed to be caused by some iron instrument. A great deal of loud talking was distinguishable in this racket, which was rather too early in the morning. "Open the door!" someone shrieked. "For heaven's sake!" Ardan saw no reason for complying with a demand so roughly expressed. However, he got up and opened the door just as it was giving way before the blows of this determined visitor. The secretary of the Gun Club burst into the room. A bomb could not have made more noise or have entered the room with less ceremony. "Last night," cried J.T. Maston ex abrupto, "our president was publicly insulted during the meeting. He provoked his adversary, who is none other than Captain Nicholl. They are fighting this morning in the wood of Skersnaw. I heard all the particulars from the mouth of Barbicane himself. If he is killed, then our scheme is at an end. We must prevent his duel, and one man alone has enough influence over Barbicane to stop him, and that man is Michel Ardan." While J.T. Maston was speaking, Michel Ardan, without interrupting him, had hastily put on his clothes, and in less than 2 minutes the two friends were making for the suburbs of Tampa Town with rapid strides. It was during this walk that Maston told Ardan the state of the case. He told him the real causes of the hostility between Barbicane and Nicholl, how it was of old date, and why, thanks to unknown friends, the president and the captain had, as yet, never met face to face. He added that it arose simply from a rivalry between iron plates and shot, and finally that the scene at the meeting was only the long-wished-for opportunity for Nicholl to pay off an old grudge. Nothing is more dreadful than private duels in America. The two adversaries attack each other like wild beasts. Then it is that they might well covet those wonderful properties of the Indians of the prairies, their quick intelligence, their ingenious cunning, their scent of the enemy. A single mistake, a moment's hesitation, a single false step may cause death. On these occasions Yankees are often accompanied by their dogs, and keep up the struggle for hours. "What demons you are!" cried Michel Ardan, when his companion had depicted this scene to him with much energy. "Yes, we are," replied J.T. modestly, "but we had better make haste." Though Michel Ardan and he had crossed the plains still wet with dew, and had taken the shortest route over creeks and rice fields, they could not reach Skersnaw in under 5 hours and a half. Barbicane must have passed the border half an hour ago. There was an old bushman working there, occupied in selling faggots from trees that had been leveled by his axe. Maston ran toward him, saying, "Have you seen a man go into the wood armed with a rifle? Barbicane, the president, my best friend?" The worthy secretary of the Gun Club thought that his president must be known by all the world. But the bushman did not seem to understand him. "A hunter?" said Ardan. "A hunter? Yes," replied the bushman. "Long ago?" "About an hour." "Too late!" cried Maston. "Have you heard any gunshots?" asked Ardan. "No." "Not one?" "Not one. That hunter did not look as if he knew how to hunt." "What is to be done?" said Maston. "We must go into the wood, at the risk of getting a ball which is not intended for us." "Ah!" cried Maston, in a tone which could not be mistaken. "I would rather have 20 balls in my own head than one in Barbicane's." "Forward, then," said Ardan, pressing his companion's hand. A few moments later the two friends had disappeared in the copse. It was a dense thicket, in which rose huge cypresses, sycamores, tulip trees, olives, tamarinds, oaks, and magnolias. These different trees had interwoven their branches into an inextricable maze, through which the eye could not penetrate. Michel Ardan and Maston walked side by side in silence through the tall grass, cutting themselves a path through the strong creepers, casting curious glances on the bushes, and momentarily expecting to hear the sound of rifles. As for the traces which Barbicane ought to have left of his passage through the wood, there was not a vestige of them visible. So they followed the barely perceptible paths along which Indians had tracked some enemy, and which the dense foliage darkly overshadowed. After an hour spent in vain pursuit, the two stopped in intensified anxiety. "It must be all over," said Maston, discouraged. "A man like Barbicane would not dodge with his enemy, or ensnare him, would not even maneuver. He is too open, too brave. He has gone straight ahead, right into the danger, and doubtless far enough from the bushman for the wind to prevent his hearing the report of the rifles." "But surely," replied Michel Ardan, "since we entered the wood we should have heard." "And what if we came too late?" cried Maston in tones of despair. For once Ardan had no reply to make, he and Maston resuming their walk in silence. From time to time, indeed, they raised great shouts, calling alternately Barbicane and Nicholl, neither of whom, however, answered their cries. Only the birds, awakened by the sound, flew past them and disappeared among the branches, while some frightened deer fled precipitately before them. For another hour their search was continued. The greater part of the wood had been explored. There was nothing to reveal the presence of the combatants. The information of the bushmen was after all doubtful, and Ardan was about to propose their abandoning this useless pursuit, when all at once Maston stopped. "Hush!" said he. "There is someone down there." "Someone?" repeated Michel Ardan. "Yes, a man. He seems motionless. His rifle is not in his hands. What can he be doing?" "But can you recognize him?" asked Ardan, whose short sight was of little use to him in such circumstances. "Yes, yes, he's turning toward us," answered Maston. "And it is?" "Captain Nicholl!" "Nicholl!" cried Michel Ardan, feeling a terrible pang of grief. "Nicholl unarmed! He has, then, no longer any fear of his adversary." "Let us go to him," said Michel Ardan, "and find out the truth." But he and his companion had barely taken 50 steps, when they paused to examine the captain more attentively. They expected to find a bloodthirsty man, happy in his revenge. On seeing him, they remained stupefied. A net, composed of very fine meshes, hung between two enormous tulip trees, and in the midst of this snare, with its wings entangled, was a poor little bird, uttering pitiful cries, while it vainly struggled to escape. The bird-catcher who had laid this snare was no human being, but a venomous spider, peculiar to that country, as large as a pigeon's egg, and armed with enormous claws. The hideous creature, instead of rushing on its prey, had beaten a sudden retreat and taken refuge in the upper branches of the tulip tree, for a formidable enemy menaced its stronghold. Here then was Nicholl, his gun on the ground, forgetful of danger, trying if possible to save the victim from its cobweb prison. At last it was accomplished, and the little bird flew joyfully away and disappeared. Nicholl lovingly watched its flight, when he heard these words pronounced by a voice full of emotion. "You are indeed a brave man!" He turned. Michel Ardan was before him, repeating in a different tone, "And a kind-hearted one." "Michel Ardan!" cried the captain, "why are you here?" "To press your hand, Nicholl, and to prevent you from either killing Barbicane or being killed by him." "Barbicane!" returned the captain. "I have been looking for him for the last 2 hours in vain. Where is he hiding?" "Nicholl," said Michel Ardan, "this is not courteous. We ought always to treat an adversary with respect. Rest assured, if Barbicane is still alive, we shall find him all the more easily, because if he has not, like you, been amusing himself with freeing oppressed birds, he must be looking for you. When we have found him, Michel Ardan tells you this, there will be no duel between you." "Between President Barbicane and myself," gravely replied Nicholl, "there is a rivalry which the death of one of us—" "Pooh, pooh!" said Ardan. "Brave fellows like you indeed! You shall not fight." "I will fight, sir." "No." "Captain," said J.T. Maston, with much feeling, "I am a friend of the President's, his alter ego, his second self. If you really must kill someone, shoot me. It will do just as well." "Sir," Nicholl replied, seizing his rifle convulsively, "these jokes—" "Our friend Maston is not joking," replied Ardan. "I fully understand his idea of being killed himself in order to save his friend. But neither he nor Barbicane will fall before the balls of Captain Nicholl. Indeed, I have so attractive a proposal to make to the two rivals that both will be eager to accept it." "What is it?" asked Nicholl with manifest incredulity. "Patience!" exclaimed Ardan. "I can only reveal it in the presence of Barbicane." "Let us go in search of him, then," cried the captain. The 3 men started off at once. The captain, having discharged his rifle, threw it over his shoulder and advanced in silence. Another half-hour passed, and the pursuit was still fruitless. Maston was oppressed by sinister forebodings. He looked fiercely at Nicholl, asking himself whether the captain's vengeance had already been satisfied, and the unfortunate Barbicane, shot, was perhaps lying dead on some bloody track. The same thought seemed to occur to Ardan, and both were casting inquiring glances on Nicholl, when suddenly Maston paused. The motionless figure of a man leaning against a gigantic catalpa 20 feet off appeared, half veiled by the foliage. "It is he," said Maston. Barbicane never moved. Ardan looked at the captain, but he did not wince. Ardan went forward, crying, "Barbicane! Barbicane!" No answer. Ardan rushed toward his friend, but in the act of seizing his arms he stopped short and uttered a cry of surprise. Barbicane, pencil in hand, was tracing geometrical figures in a memorandum book, while his unloaded rifle lay beside him on the ground. Absorbed in his studies, Barbicane, in his turn forgetful of the duel, had seen and heard nothing. When Ardan took his hand, he looked up and stared at his visitor in astonishment. "Ah, it is you!" he cried at last. "I have found it, my friend! I have found it!" "What?" "My plan." "What plan?" "The plan for countering the effect of the shock at the departure of the projectile." "Indeed," said Michel Ardan, looking at the captain out of the corner of his eye. "Yes, water, simply water, which will act as a spring. Ah, Maston!" cried Barbicane, "you here also?" "Himself," replied Ardan, "and permit me to introduce you at the same time to the worthy Captain Nicholl." "Nicholl!" cried Barbicane, who jumped up at once. "Pardon me, Captain, I had quite forgotten. I am ready." Michel Ardan interfered, without giving the two enemies time to say anything more. "Thank Heaven!" said he. "It is a happy thing that brave men like you two did not meet sooner. We should now have been mourning for one or other of you. But thanks to Providence, which has interfered, there is now no further cause for alarm. When one forgets one's anger in mechanics or in cobwebs, it is a sign that the anger is not dangerous." Michel Ardan then told the president how the captain had been found occupied. "I put it to you now," said he in conclusion. "Are two such good fellows as you are made on purpose to smash each other's skulls with shot?" There was in the situation somewhat of the ridiculous, something quite unexpected, Michel Ardan saw this and determined to effect a reconciliation. "My good friends," said he, with his most bewitching smile, "this is nothing but a misunderstanding, nothing more. Well, to prove that it is all over between you, accept frankly the proposal I am going to make to you." "Make it," said Nicholl. "Our friend Barbicane believes that his projectile will go straight to the moon?" "Yes, certainly," replied the president. "And our friend Nicholl is persuaded it will fall back upon the earth?" "I am certain of it," cried the captain. "Good," said Ardan. "I cannot pretend to make you agree, but I suggest this: go with me, and so see whether we are stopped on our journey." "What?" exclaimed J.T. Maston, stupefied. The two rivals, on this sudden proposal, looked steadily at each other. Barbicane waited for the captain's answer. Nicholl watched for the decision of the president. "Well," said Michel, "there is now no fear of the shock." "Done!" cried Barbicane. But quickly as he pronounced the word, he was not before Nicholl. "Hurrah! Bravo! Hip, hip, hurrah!" cried Michel, giving a hand to each of the late adversaries. "Now that it is all settled, my friends, allow me to treat you after French fashion. Let us be off to breakfast." End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 22. The New Citizen of the United States. That same day all America heard of the affair of Captain Nicholl and President Barbicane, as well as its singular denouement. From that day forth Michel Ardan had not one moment's rest. Deputations from all corners of the Union harassed him without cessation or intermission. He was compelled to receive them all, whether he would or no. How many people he was "hail fellow well met" with, it is impossible to guess. Such a triumphal result would have intoxicated any other man, but he managed to keep himself in a state of delightful semi-tipsiness. Among the deputations of all kinds which assailed him, that of the lunatics were careful not to forget what they owed to the future conqueror of the moon. One day, certain of these poor people, so numerous in America, came to call upon him, and requested permission to return with him to their native country. "Singular hallucination," said he to Barbicane, after having dismissed the deputation with promises to convey numbers of messages to friends in the moon. "Do you believe in the influence of the moon upon distempers? Scarcely. No more do I, despite some remarkable recorded facts of history. For instance, during an epidemic in 1693, a large number of persons died at the very moment of an eclipse. The celebrated Bacon always fainted during an eclipse. Charles VI. relapsed 6 times into madness during the year 1399, sometimes during the new, sometimes during the full moon. Gall observed that insane persons underwent an accession of their disorder twice in every month, at the epochs of new and full moon. In fact, numerous observations made upon fevers, somnambulisms, and other human maladies seem to prove that the moon does exercise some mysterious influence upon man." "But the how and the wherefore?" asked Barbicane. "Well, I can only give you the answer which Arago borrowed from the Plutarch, which is 19 centuries old. Perhaps the stories are not true." In the height of his triumph, Michel Ardan had to encounter all the annoyances incidental to a man of celebrity. Managers of entertainments wanted to exhibit him. Barnum offered him $1,000,000 to make a tour of the United States in his show. As for his photographs, they were sold of all sizes, and his portrait taken in every imaginable posture. More than 500,000 copies were disposed of in an incredibly short space of time. But it was not only the men who paid him homage, but the women as well. He might have married well 100 times over, if he had been willing to settle in life. The old maids, in particular, of 40 years and upward, and dry in proportion, devoured his photographs day and night. They would have married him by hundreds, even if he had imposed upon them the condition of accompanying him into space. He had, however, no intention of transplanting a race of Franco-Americans upon the surface of the moon. He therefore declined all offers. As soon as he could withdraw from these somewhat embarrassing demonstrations, he went, accompanied by his friends, to pay a visit to the Columbiad. He was highly gratified by his inspection, and made the descent to the bottom of the tube of this gigantic machine, which was presently to launch him to the regions of the moon. It is necessary here to mention a proposal of J.T. Maston's. When the secretary of the Gun Club found that Barbicane and Nicholl accepted the proposal of Michel Ardan, he determined to join them, and make one of a smug party of 4. So one day he determined to be admitted as one of the travelers. Barbicane, pained at having to refuse him, gave him clearly to understand that the projectile could not possibly contain so many passengers. Maston, in despair, went in search of Michel Ardan, who counselled him to resign himself to the situation, adding 1 or 2 arguments ad hominem. "You see, old fellow," he said, "you must not take what I say in bad part, but really, between ourselves, you are too incomplete a condition to appear in the moon." "Incomplete!" shrieked the valiant invalid. "Yes, my dear fellow, imagine our meeting some of the inhabitants up there. Would you like to give them such a melancholy notion of what goes on down here, to teach them what war is, to inform them that we employ our time chiefly in devouring each other, in smashing arms and legs, and that too on a globe which is capable of supporting 100 billions of inhabitants, and which actually does contain nearly 200 millions? Why, my worthy friend, we should have to turn you out of doors. But still, if you arrive there in pieces, you will be as incomplete as I am." "Unquestionably," replied Michel Ardan, "but we shall not." In fact, a preparatory experiment tried on the 18th of October had yielded the best results and caused the most well-grounded hopes of success. Barbicane, desirous of obtaining some notion of the effect of the shock at the moment of the projectile's departure, had procured a 38-inch mortar from the arsenal of Pensacola. He had this placed on the bank of Hillsborough roads, in order that the shell might fall back into the sea, and the shock be thereby destroyed. His object was to ascertain the extent of the shock of departure, and not that of the return. A hollow projectile had been prepared for this curious experiment. A thick padding, fastened upon a kind of elastic network, made of the best steel, lined the inside of the walls. It was a veritable nest, most carefully wadded. "What a pity I can't find room in there," said J.T. Maston, regretting that his height did not allow of his trying the adventure. Within this shell were shut up a large cat and a squirrel belonging to J.T. Maston, and of which he was particularly fond. They were desirous, however, of ascertaining how this little animal, least of all other subjects to giddiness, would endure this experimental voyage. The mortar was charged with 160 pounds of powder, and the shell placed in the chamber. On being fired, the projectile rose with great velocity, described a majestic parabola, attained a height of about 1,000 feet, and with a graceful curve descended in the midst of the vessels that lay there at anchor. Without a moment's loss of time, a small boat put off in the direction of its fall. Some divers plunged into the water and attached ropes to the handles of the shell, which was quickly dragged on board. 5 minutes did not elapse between the moment of enclosing the animals and that of unscrewing the coverlid of their prison. Ardan, Barbicane, Maston, and Nicholl were present on board the boat, and assisted at the operation with an interest which may readily be comprehended. Hardly had the shell been opened when the cat leaped out, slightly bruised, but full of life, and exhibiting no signs whatever of having made an aerial expedition. No trace, however, of the squirrel could be discovered. The truth at last became apparent. The cat had eaten its fellow traveler. J.T. Maston grieved much for the loss of his poor squirrel, and proposed to add its case to that of other martyrs to science. After this experiment all hesitation, all fear disappeared. Besides, Barbicane's plans would ensure greater perfection for his projectile, and go far to annihilate altogether the effects of the shock. Nothing now remained but to go. 2 days later Michel Ardan received a message from the President of the United States, in honour of which he showed himself especially sensible. After the example of his illustrious fellow-countryman, the Marquis de Lafayette, the government had decreed to him the title of Citizen of the United States of America. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. The Projectile Vehicle. On the completion of the Columbiad, the public interest centered in the projectile itself. The vehicle which was destined to carry the three hardy adventurers into space. The new plans had been sent to Breadwell and Company, of Albany, with the request for their speedy execution. The projectile was consequently cast on the 2nd of November, and immediately forwarded by the Eastern Railway to Stones Hill, which it reached without accident on the 10th of that month, where Michel Ardan, Barbicane, and Nicholl were waiting impatiently for it. The projectile had now to be filled to the depth of 3 feet with a bed of water, intended to support a watertight wooden disc, which worked easily within the walls of the projectile. It was upon this kind of raft that the travelers were to take their place. This body of water was divided by horizontal partitions, which the shock of the departure would have to break in succession. Then each sheet of the water, from the lowest to the highest, running off into escape tubes toward the top of the projectile, constituted a kind of spring, and the wooden disc, supplied with extremely powerful plugs, would not strike the lowest plate except after breaking successively the different partitions. Undoubtedly the travelers would still have to encounter a violent recoil after the complete escapement of the water, but the first shock would be almost entirely destroyed by this powerful spring. The upper parts of the walls were lined with a thick padding of leather, fastened upon springs of the best steel, behind which the escape tubes were completely concealed. Thus all imaginable precautions had been taken for averting the first shock, and if they did get crushed, they must, as Michel Ardan said, be made of very bad materials. The entrance into this metallic tower was by a narrow aperture contrived in the wall of the cone. This was hermetically closed by a plate of aluminum, fastened internally by powerful screw pressure. The travelers could therefore quit their prison at pleasure as soon as they should reach the moon. Light and view were given by means of 4 thick lenticular glass scuttles, 2 pierced in the circular wall itself, the 3rd in the bottom, the 4th in the top. These scuttles then were protected against the shock of departure by plates let into solid grooves, which could easily be opened outward by unscrewing them from the inside. Reservoirs firmly fixed contained water and the necessary provisions, and fire and light were procurable by means of a gas, contained in a special reservoir under a pressure of several atmospheres. They had only to turn a tap, and for 6 hours the gas would light and warm this comfortable vehicle. There now remained only the question of air, for allowing for the consumption of air by Barbicane, his 2 companions, and 2 dogs which he proposed taking with him, it was necessary to renew the air of the projectile. Now air consists principally of 21 parts oxygen and 79 of nitrogen. The lungs absorb the oxygen, which is indispensable for the support of life, and reject the nitrogen. The air expired loses nearly 5% of the former and contains nearly an equal volume of carbonic acid produced by the combustion of the elements of the blood. In an airtight enclosure, then, after a certain time all the oxygen of the air will be replaced by the carbonic acid, a gas fatal to life. There were two things to be done then: first, to replace the absorbed oxygen; secondly, to destroy the expired carbonic acid, both easy enough to do, by means of chlorate of potassium and caustic potash. The former is a salt which appears under the form of white crystals. When raised to a temperature of 400 degrees, it is transformed into chlorure of potassium, and the oxygen which it contains is entirely liberated. Now 28 pounds of chlorate of potassium produces 7 pounds of oxygen, or 2,400 litres, the quantity necessary for the travellers during 24 hours. Caustic potash has a great affinity for carbonic acid, and it is sufficient to shake it in order for it to seize upon the acid and form bicarbonate of potassium. By these two means they would be enabled to restore to the vitiated air its life-supporting properties. It is necessary, however, to add that the experiments had hitherto been made in anima vili. Whatever its scientific accuracy was, they were at present ignorant how it would answer with human beings. The honour of putting it to the proof was energetically claimed by J.T. Maston. "Since I am not to go," said the brave artillerist, "I may at least live for a week in the projectile." It would have been hard to refuse him, so they consented to his wish. A sufficient quantity of chlorate of potassium and of caustic potash was placed at his disposal, together with provisions for 8 days, and having shaken hands with his friends on the 12th of November at 6 o'clock a.m., after strictly informing them not to open his prison before the 20th at 6 o'clock p.m., he slid down the projectile, the plate of which at once hermetically sealed. What did he do with himself during that week? They could get no information. The thickness of the walls of the projectile prevented any sound reaching from the inside to the outside. On the 20th of November at 6 p.m. exactly, the plate was opened. The friends of J.T. Maston had been all along in a state of much anxiety, but they were promptly reassured on hearing a jolly voice shouting a boisterous hurrah. Presently afterward the secretary of the Gun Club appeared at the top of the cone in a triumphant attitude. He had grown fat. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 24. The Telescope of the Rocky Mountains. On the 20th of October in the preceding year, after the close of the subscription, the president of the Gun Club had credited the Observatory of Cambridge with the necessary sums for the construction of a gigantic optical instrument. This instrument was designed for the purpose of rendering visible on the surface of the moon any object exceeding 9 feet in diameter. At the period when the Gun Club essayed their great experiment, such instruments had reached a high degree of perfection, and produced some magnificent results. 2 telescopes in particular at this time were possessed of remarkable power and of gigantic dimensions. The first, constructed by Herschel, was 36 feet in length, and had an object glass of 4 feet 6 inches. It possessed a magnifying power of 6,000. The second was raised in Ireland, in Parsonstown Park, and belongs to Lord Rosse. The length of this tube is 48 feet. and the diameter of its object glass 6 feet. It magnifies 6,400 times, and required an immense erection of brickwork and masonry for the purpose of working it, its weight being 12½ tons. Still, despite these colossal dimensions, the actual enlargements scarcely exceeded 6,000 times in round numbers. Consequently, the moon was brought within no nearer an apparent distance than 39 miles, and objects of less than 60 feet in diameter, unless they were of very considerable length, were still imperceptible. In the present case, dealing with a projectile 9 feet in diameter and 15 feet long, it became necessary to bring the moon within an apparent distance of 5 miles at most, and for that purpose to establish a magnifying power of 48,000 times. Such was the question proposed to the Observatory of Cambridge. There was no lack of funds; the difficulty was purely one of construction. After considerable discussion as to the best form and principle of the proposed instrument, the work was finally commenced. According to the calculations of the Observatory of Cambridge, the tube of the new reflector would require to be 280 feet in length, and the object glass 16 feet in diameter. Colossal as these dimensions may appear, they were diminutive in comparison with the 10,000-foot telescope proposed by the astronomer Hooke only a few years ago. Regarding the choice of locality, that matter was promptly determined. The object was to select some lofty mountain, and there are not many of these in the United States. In fact, there are but 2 chains of moderate elevation between which runs the magnificent Mississippi, the king of rivers, as these republican Yankees delight to call it. Eastwards rise the Appalachians, the very highest point of which, in New Hampshire, does not exceed the very moderate altitude of 5,600 feet. On the west, however, rise the Rocky Mountains, that immense range which, commencing at the Straits of Magellan, follows the western coast of southern America under the name of the Andes or the Cordilleras, until it crosses the Isthmus of Panama, and runs up the whole of North America to the very borders of the Polar Sea. The highest elevation of this range still does not exceed 10,700 feet. With this elevation, nevertheless, the Gun Club were compelled to be content, inasmuch as they had determined that both telescope and Columbiad should be erected within the limits of the Union. All the necessary apparatus was consequently sent to the summit of Long's Peak, in the territory of Missouri. Neither pen nor language can describe the difficulties of all kinds which the American engineers had to surmount, of the prodigies of daring and skill which they accomplished. They had to raise enormous stones, massive pieces of wrought iron, heavy corner clamps, and huge portions of cylinder, with an object glass weighing nearly 30,000 pounds, above the line of perpetual snow for more than 10,000 feet in height, after crossing desert prairies, impenetrable forests, fearful rapids, far from all centres of population, and in the midst of savage regions, in which every detail of life becomes an almost insoluble problem. And yet, notwithstanding these innumerable obstacles, American genius triumphed. In less than a year after the commencement of the works, toward the close of September, the gigantic reflector rose into the air to a height of 280 feet. It was raised by means of an enormous iron crane. An ingenious mechanism allowed it to be easily worked toward all the points of the heavens, and to follow the stars from the one horizon to the other during their journey through the heavens. It had cost $400,000. The first time it was directed towards the moon, the observers evinced both curiosity and anxiety. What were they about to discover in the field of this telescope, which magnifies objects 48,000 times? Would they perceive peoples, herds of lunar animals, towns, lakes, seas? No, there was nothing which science had not already discovered, and on all the points of its disc the volcanic nature of the moon became determinable with the utmost precision. But the telescope of the Rocky Mountains, before doing its duty to the Gun Club, rendered immense services to astronomy. Thanks to its penetrative power, the depths of the heavens were sounded to the utmost extent. The apparent diameter of the great number of stars was accurately measured, and Mr. Clark, of the Cambridge staff, resolved the Crab nebula in Tarsus, which the reflector of Lord Rosse had never been able to decompose. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonie Rose. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 25. Final Details. It was the 22nd of November. The departure was to take place in 10 days. One operation alone remained to be accomplished to bring all to a happy termination. An operation delicate and perilous, requiring infinite precautions, and against the success of which Captain Nicholl had laid his third bet. It was, in fact, nothing less than the loading of the Columbiad, and the introduction into it of 400,000 pounds of gun cotton. Nicholl had thought, not perhaps without reason, that the handling of such formidable quantities of pyroxyle would, in all probability, involve a grave catastrophe, and at any rate, that this immense mass of eminently inflammable matter would inevitably ignite when submitted to the pressure of the projectile. There were indeed dangers accruing, as before, from the carelessness of the Americans, but Barbicane had set his heart on success, and took all possible precautions. In the first place, he was very careful as to the transportation of the gun cotton to Stones Hill. He had it conveyed in small quantities, carefully packed in sealed cases. These were brought by rail from Tampa Town to the camp, and from thence were taken to the Columbiad by barefooted workmen, who deposited them in their places by means of cranes placed at the orifice of the cannon. No steam engine was permitted to work, and every fire was extinguished within 2 miles of the works. Even in November they feared to work by day, lest the sun's rays acting on the gun cotton might lead to unhappy results. This led to their working at night, by light produced in a vacuum by means of Ruhmkorff's apparatus, which threw an artificial brightness into the depths of the Columbiad. There the cartridges were arranged with the utmost regularity, connected by a metallic thread, destined to communicate to them all simultaneously the electric spark, by which means this mass of gun cotton was eventually to be ignited. By the 28th of November, 800 cartridges had been placed in the bottom of the Columbiad. So far the operation had been successful. But what confusion, what anxieties, what struggles were undergone by President Barbicane! In vain had he refused admission to Stones Hill. Every day the inquisitive neighbors scaled the palisades, some even carrying their imprudence to the point of smoking while surrounded by bales of gun cotton. Barbicane was in a perpetual state of alarm. J.T. Maston seconded him to the best of his ability by giving vigorous chase to the intruders, and carefully picking up the still lighted cigar ends which the Yankees threw about. A somewhat difficult task, seeing that more than 300,000 persons were gathered round the enclosure. Michael Arden had volunteered to superintend the transport of the cartridges to the mouth of the Columbiad, but the President, having surprised him with an enormous cigar in his mouth, while he was hunting out the rash spectators to whom he himself offered so dangerous an example, saw that he could not trust this fearless smoker, and was therefore obliged to mount a special guard over him. At last, Providence being propitious, this wonderful loading came to a happy termination, Captain Nicholl's third bet being thus lost. It remained now to introduce the projectile into the Columbiad, and to place it on its soft bed of gun-cotton. But before doing this, all those things necessary for the journey had to be carefully arranged in the projectile vehicle. These necessaries were numerous, and had Arden been allowed to follow his own wishes, there would have been no space remaining for the travelers. It is impossible to conceive of half the things this charming Frenchman wished to convey to the moon, a veritable stock of useless trifles. But Barbicane interfered, and refused admission to anything not absolutely needed. Several thermometers, barometers, and telescopes were packed in the instrument case. The travelers, being desirous of examining the moon carefully during their voyage, in order to facilitate their studies, they took with them Boer and Moodler's excellent Mappa Selenographica, a masterpiece of patience and observation, which they hoped would enable them to identify those physical features in the moon with which they were acquainted. This map reproduced with scrupulous fidelity the smallest details of the lunar surface which faces the earth. The mountains, valleys, craters, peaks, and ridges were all represented, with their exact dimensions, relative positions, and names, from the mountains Dorfel and Leibnitz on the eastern side of the disk to the Mare Frigoris of the North Pole. They also took 3 rifles and 3 fowling pieces, and a large quantity of balls, shot, and powder. "We cannot tell whom we shall have to deal with," said Michael Arden. "Men or beasts may possibly object to our visit. It is only wise to take all precautions." These defensive weapons were accompanied by pickaxes, crowbars, saws, and other useful implements, not to mention clothing adapted to every temperature, from that of polar regions to that of the torrid zone. Arden wished to convey a number of animals of different sorts, not indeed a pair of every known species, as he could not see the necessity of acclimatizing serpents, tigers, alligators, or any other noxious beasts in the moon. "Nevertheless," he said to Barbicane, "some valuable and useful beasts, bullocks, cows, horses, and donkeys would bear the journey very well, and would also be very useful to us." "I dare say, my dear Arden," replied the President, "but our projectile vehicle is no Noah's Ark, from which it differs both in dimensions and object. Let us confine ourselves to possibilities." After a prolonged discussion, it was agreed that the travelers should restrict themselves to a sporting dog belonging to Nicholl and to a large Newfoundland. Several packets of seeds were also included among the necessaries. Michael Arden, indeed, was anxious to add some sacks full of earth to sow them in. As it was, he took a dozen shrubs carefully wrapped up in straw to plant in the moon. The important question of provisions still remained, it being necessary to provide against the possibility of their finding the moon absolutely barren. Barbicane managed so successfully that he supplied them with sufficient rations for a year. These consisted of preserved meats and vegetables, reduced by strong hydraulic pressure to the smallest possible dimensions. They were also supplied with brandy, and took water enough for 2 months, being confident, from astronomical observations, that there was no lack of water on the moon's surface. As to provisions, Doubtless the inhabitants of the earth would find nourishment somewhere in the moon. Arden never questioned this. Indeed, had he done so, he would never have undertaken the journey. "Besides," he said one day to his friends, "we shall not be completely abandoned by our terrestrial friends. They will take care not to forget us." "No, indeed," replied J.T. Maston. "Nothing would be simpler," replied Arden. "The Columbiad will be always there. Well, whenever the moon is in a favorable condition as to the zenith, if not to the perigee, that is to say, about once a year, could you not send us a shell packed with provisions, which we might expect on some appointed day?" "Hurrah, hurrah!" cried J.T. Maston. "What an ingenious fellow! What a splendid idea! Indeed, my good friends, we shall not forget you." "I shall reckon upon you." "Then, you see, we shall receive news regularly from the earth, and we shall indeed be stupid if we hit upon no plan for communicating with our good friends here." These words inspired such confidence that Michael Arden carried all the gun club with him in his enthusiasm. What he said seemed so simple and so easy, so sure of success, that none could be so sordidly attached to this earth as to hesitate to follow the three travelers on their lunar expedition. All being ready at last, it remained to place the projectile in the Columbiad, an operation abundantly accompanied by dangers and difficulties. The enormous shell was conveyed to the summit of Stone's Hill. There, powerful cranes raised it and held it suspended over the mouth of the cylinder. It was a fearful moment. What if the chains should break under its enormous weight? The sudden fall of such a body would inevitably cause the gun cotton to explode. Fortunately, this did not happen, and some hours later the projectile vehicle descended gently into the heart of the cannon and rested on its couch of peroxyle, a veritable bed of explosive eiderdown. Its pressure had no result, other than the more effectual ramming down of the charge in the Columbiad. "I have lost," said the captain, who forthwith paid President Barbicane the sum of $3,000. Barbicane did not wish to accept the money from one of his fellow travelers, but gave way at last before the determination of Nicholl, who wished before leaving the earth to fulfill all his engagements. "No," said Michael Arden, "I have only one thing more to wish for you, my brave captain." "What is that?" asked Nicholl. "It is that you may lose your 2 other bets. Then we shall be sure not to be stopped on our journey." End of chapter 25. Recording by Leonie Rose.
Chapter 26. From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 26. Fire! The 1st of December had arrived, the fatal day, for if the projectile were not discharged that very night at 10 hours 48 minutes 40 seconds p.m., more than 18 years must roll by before the moon would again present herself under the same conditions of zenith and perigee. The weather was magnificent. Despite the approach of winter, the sun shone brightly, and bathed in its radiant light that earth which 3 of its denizens were about to abandon for a new world. How many persons lost their rest on the night which preceded this long-expected day! All hearts beat with disquietude, save only the heart of Michael Arden. That imperturbable personage came and went with his habitual business-like air, while nothing whatever denoted that any unusual matter preoccupied his mind. After dawn an innumerable multitude covered the prairie which extends, as far as the eye can reach, round Stones Hill. Every quarter of an hour the railway brought fresh accessions of sightseers, and, according to the statement of the Tampa Town Observer, not less than 5 millions of spectators thronged to the soil of Florida. For a whole month previously the mass of these persons had bivouacked round the enclosure, and laid the foundations for a town which was afterward called Ardenstown. The whole plain was covered with huts, cottages, and tents. Every nation under the sun was represented there, and every language might be heard spoken at the same time. It was a perfect Babel re-enacted. All the various classes of American society were mingled together in terms of absolute equality. Bankers, farmers, sailors, cotton planters, brokers, merchants, watermen, magistrates, elbowed each other in the most free and easy way. Louisiana Creoles fraternized with farmers from Indiana. Kentucky and Tennessee gentlemen and haughty Virginians conversed with trappers and the half-savages of the lakes and butchers from Cincinnati. Broad-brimmed white hats and Panamas, blue cotton trousers, light-coloured stockings, cambric frills were all here displayed, while upon shirt-fronts, wristbands, and neckties, upon every finger, upon the very ears, they wore an assortment of rings, shirt-pins, brooches, and trinkets, of which the value only equalled the execrable taste. Women, children, and servants, in equally expensive dress, surrounded their husbands, fathers, or masters, who resembled the patriarchs of tribes, in the midst of their immense households. At meal times all fell to work upon the dishes peculiar to the southern states, and consumed with an appetite that threatened speedy exhaustion of the victualling powers of Florida, fricasseed frogs, stuffed monkeys, fish chowder, underdone possum, and raccoon steaks. And as for the liqueurs which accompanied this indigestible repast, the shouts, the vociferations that resounded through the bars and taverns, decorated with glasses, tankards, and bottles of marvellous shape, mortars of pounding sugar, and bundles of straws. "Mint julep," roars one of the barmen. "Claret sangria," shouts another. "Cocktail," "brandy smash," "real mint julep in the new style." All these cries intermingled produced a bewildering and deafening hubbub. But on this day, 1st of December, such sounds were rare. No one thought of eating or drinking, and at 4 p.m. there were vast numbers of spectators who had not even taken their customary lunch. And, a still more significant fact, even the national passion for play seemed quelled for the time under the general excitement of the hour. Up till nightfall, a dull, noiseless agitation, such as precedes great catastrophes, ran through the anxious multitude. An indescribable uneasiness pervaded all minds, an indefinable sensation which oppressed the heart. Every one wished it was over. However, about 7 o'clock the heavy silence was dissipated. The moon rose above the horizon. Millions of hurrahs hailed her appearance. She was punctual to the rendezvous, and shouts of welcome greeted her on all sides, as her pale beams shone gracefully in the clear heavens. At this moment the 3 intrepid travellers appeared. This was the signal for renewed cries of still greater intensity. Instantly the vast assemblage, as with one accord, struck up the national hymn of the United States, and "Yankee Doodle," sung by 5 million of hearty throats, rose like a roaring tempest to the farthest limits of the atmosphere. Then a profound silence reigned throughout the crowd. The Frenchman and the 2 Americans had by this time entered the enclosure reserved in the centre of the multitude. They were accompanied by the members of the Gun Club, and by deputations sent from all the European observatories. Barbicane, cool and collected, was giving his final directions. Nicholl, with compressed lips, his arms crossed behind his neck, walked with a firm and measured step. Michel Ardan, always easy, dressed in thorough traveller's costume, leathern gaiters on his legs, pouch by his side, in loose velvet suit, cigar in mouth, was full of inexhaustible gaiety, laughing, joking, playing pranks with J.T. Maston. In one word, he was the thorough Frenchman, and worse, a Parisian, to the last moment. 10 o'clock struck. The moment had arrived for taking their places in the projectile. The necessary operations for the descent, and the subsequent removal of the cranes and scaffolding that inclined over the mouth of the Columbiad, required a certain period of time. Barbicane had regulated his chronometer to the 10th part of a second by that of Murchison the engineer, who was charged with the duty of firing the gun by means of an electric spark. Thus the travelers enclosed within the projectile were enabled to follow with their eyes the impressive needle which marked the precise moment of their departure. The moment had arrived for saying good-bye. The scene was a touching one. Despite his feverish gaiety, even Michel Ardan was touched. J.T. Maston had found in his own dry eyes one ancient tear, which he had doubtless reserved for the occasion. He dropped it on the forehead of his dear president. "Can I not go?" he said. "There is still time." "Impossible, old fellow," replied Barbicane. A few moments later the three fellow travelers had ensconced themselves in the projectile and screwed down the plate which covered the entrance aperture. The mouth of the Columbiad, now completely disencumbered, was open entirely to the sky. The moon advanced upward in a heaven of purest clearness, outshining in her passage the twinkling light of the stars. She passed over the constellation of the Twins, and was now nearing the halfway point between the horizon and the zenith. A terrible silence weighed upon the entire scene. Not a breath of wind upon the earth, not a sound of breathing from the countless chests of the spectators. Their hearts seemed afraid to beat. All eyes were fixed upon the yawning mouth of the Columbiad. Murchison followed with his eye the hand of his chronometer. It wanted scarce 40 seconds to the moment of departure, but each second seemed to last an age. At the 20th there was a general shudder, as it occurred to the minds of that vast assemblage that the bold travelers shut up within the projectile were also counting those terrible seconds. Some few cries here and there escaped the crowd. 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. Fire! Instantly Murchison pressed with his finger the key of the electric battery, restored the current of the fluid, and discharged the spark into the breech of the Columbiad. An appalling, unearthly report followed instantly, such as can be compared to nothing whatever known, not even to the roar of thunder, or to the blast of volcanic explosions. No word can convey the slightest idea of the terrific sound. An immense spout of fire shot up from the bowels of the earth, as from a crater. The earth heaved up, and with a great difficulty some few spectators obtained a momentary glimpse of the projectile victoriously cleaving the air in the midst of the fiery vapors. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonie Rose. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 27. Foul Weather. At the moment when that pyramid of fire rose to a prodigious height into the air, the glare of flame lit up the whole of Florida, and for a moment day superseded night over a considerable extent of the country. This immense canopy of fire was perceived at a distance of 100 miles out at sea, and more than one ship's captain entered in his log the appearance of this gigantic meteor. The discharge of the Columbiad was accompanied by a perfect earthquake. Florida was shaken to its very depths. The gases of the powder, expanded by heat, forced back the atmospheric strata with tremendous violence, and this artificial hurricane rushed like a waterspout through the air. Not a single spectator remained on his feet. Men, women, children, all lay prostrate like ears of corn under a tempest. There ensued a terrible tumult. A large number of persons were seriously injured. J.T. Maston, who, despite all dictates of prudence, had kept in advance of the mass, was pitched back 120 feet, shooting like a projectile over the heads of his fellow citizens. 300,000 persons remained deaf for a time, and as though struck stupefied. As soon as the first effects were over, the injured, the deaf, and lastly the crowd in general woke up with frenzied cries. "Hurrah for Arden! Hurrah for Barbicane! Hurrah for Nicholl!" rose to the skies. Thousands of persons, noses in air, armed with telescopes and race glasses, were questioning space, forgetting all contusions and emotions in the one idea of watching for the projectile. They looked in vain. It was no longer to be seen, and they were obliged to wait for telegrams from Long's Peak. The director of the Cambridge Observatory was at his post on the Rocky Mountains, and to him, as a skilful and persevering astronomer, all observations had been confided. But an unforeseen phenomenon came in to subject the public impatience to a severe trial. The weather, hitherto so fine, suddenly changed. The sky became heavy with clouds. It could not have been otherwise after the terrible derangement of the atmospheric strata, and the dispersion of the enormous quantity of vapor arising from the combustion of 200,000 pounds of peroxide. On the morrow the horizon was covered with clouds, a thick and impenetrable curtain between earth and sky, which unhappily extended as far as the Rocky Mountains. It was a fatality. But since man had chosen so to disturb the atmosphere, he was bound to accept the consequences of his experiment. Supposing now that the experiment had succeeded, the travelers, having started on the 1st of December at 10 hours 46 minutes 40 seconds p.m., were due on the 4th at 0 hour p.m. at their destination, so that up to that time it would have been very difficult after all to have observed, under such conditions, a body so small as the shell. Therefore they waited with what patience they might. From the 4th to the 6th of December inclusive, the weather remaining much the same in America, the great European instruments of Herschel, Rossi, and Foucault were constantly directed toward the moon, for the weather was then magnificent, but the comparative weakness of their glasses prevented any trustworthy observations being made. On the 7th the sky seemed to lighten. They were in hopes now, but their hope was of but short duration, and at night again thick clouds hid the starry vault from all eyes. Matters were now becoming serious, when on the 9th the sun reappeared for an instant, as if for the purpose of teasing the Americans. It was received with hisses, and wounded, no doubt, by such a reception, showed itself very sparing of its rays. On the 10th, no change. J.T. Maston went nearly mad, and great fears were entertained regarding the brain of this worthy individual, which had hitherto been so well preserved within his gutta percha cranium. But on the 11th, one of those inexplicable tempests peculiar to those intertropical regions was let loose in the atmosphere. A terrific east wind swept away the groups of clouds which had been so long gathering, and at night the semi-disk of the orb of night rode majestically amid the soft constellations of the sky. End of chapter 27. Recording by Leonie Rose.
Chapter 28 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 28. A New Star. That very night the startling news, so impatiently awaited, burst like a thunderbolt over the United States of the Union, and thence, darting across the ocean, ran through all the telegraphic wires of the globe. The projectile had been detected, thanks to the gigantic reflector of Long's Peak. Here is the note received by the director of the Observatory of Cambridge. It contains the scientific conclusion regarding this great experiment of the Gun Club. Long's Peak, December 12th. To the officers of the Observatory of Cambridge. The projectile discharged by the Columbiad at Stones Hill has been detected by Messrs. Belfast and J.T. Maston, 12th of December, at 8:47 p.m., the moon having entered her last quarter. This projectile has not arrived at its destination. It has passed by the side, but sufficiently near to be retained by the lunar attraction. The rectilinear movement has thus become changed into a circular motion of extreme velocity, and it is now pursuing an elliptical orbit around the moon, of which it has become a true satellite. The elements of this new star we have as yet been unable to determine. We do not yet know the velocity of its passage. The distance which separates it from the surface of the moon may be estimated at about 2,833 miles. However, two hypotheses come here into our consideration. 1. Either the attraction of the moon will end by drawing them into itself, and the travellers will attain their destination, or 2. The projectile, following an immutable law, will continue to gravitate round the moon till the end of time. At some future time, our observations will be able to determine this point, but till then the experiment of the Gun Club can have no other result than to have provided our solar system with a new star. J. Belfast. To how many questions did this unexpected denouement give rise? What mysterious results was the future reserving for the investigation of science? At all events, the names of Nicole, Barbicane, and Michael Arden were certain to be immortalized in the annals of astronomy. When the dispatch from Long's Peak had once become known, there was but one universal feeling of surprise and alarm. Was it possible to go to the aid of these bold travellers? No, for they had placed themselves beyond the pale of humanity by crossing the limits imposed by the Creator on his earthly creatures. They had air enough for 2 months, they had victuals enough for 12, but after that? There was only one man who would not admit that the situation was desperate. He alone had confidence, and that was their devoted friend J.T. Maston. Besides, he never let them go out of sight. His home was henceforth the post at Long's Peak, his horizon the mirror of that immense reflector. As soon as the moon rose above the horizon, he immediately caught her in the field of the telescope. He never let her go for an instant out of his sight, and followed her assiduously in her course through the stellar spaces. He watched with untiring patience the passage of the projectile across her silvery disc, and really the worthy man remained in perpetual communication with his three friends, whom he did not despair of seeing again some day. "Those three men," said he, "have carried into space all the resources of art, science, and industry. With that, one can do anything, and you will see that, some day, they will come out all right." End of chapter 28. An end of From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne.